الحمد لله الذي أرسل رسوله بالبينات والهدى وأنزل معه الكتاب والميزان ليقوم الناس بالقسط وأنزل الحديد فيه بأس شديد ومنافع للناس وليعلم الله من ينصره رسله بالغيب إن الله قوي عزيز. وختمهم بمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم الذي أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على دين كله، وأيده بالسلطان النصير الجامع معنى العلم والقلم للهداية والحجة ومعنى القدرة والسيف للنصرة والتعزية. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله، اللهم صل وسلم عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Jazakumullah khair, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us, Insha'Allah, our intentions behind holding these discussions, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, to make that intention purely for His sake alone, and to bless these gatherings, Insha'Allah. And Jazakumullah khair to our brother Azim, who is chairing the event, MashaAllah. So, we're here to discuss one of the great personalities of Islam inside the Islamic history, and someone who is on the tongues of many of the youth and those people who are concerned with Islam today, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah. And the first question we need to ask is, why do we talk about these personalities? Why is it we need to discuss this Shaykh or that Shaykh? Whether it's Ahmed bin Hanbal, or Imam Malik, or Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, or even before that. Why do we discuss the Sahaba? Why do we discuss Umar bin Khattab? Why do we discuss Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? Why do we discuss, even before that, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam? And even before that, why do we discuss, or why is it mentioned inside the Qur'an, all of the prophets before Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, or various prophets before Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, mentioning their stories? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings their stories inside the Qur'an. In fact, a large portion of the Qur'an is discussing specifically the stories of the prophets. So why do we know that a single letter of Qur'an wouldn't be revealed without a purpose? So why do we study these stories? Is it for us to gather together and to feel happy and to feel close and to allow our emotions to get raised because we hear the story of a legend which passed us by, for example? To hear about these great personalities and just, that's our great history, and to leave it at that? No. This is not why we want to discuss and bring forward the discussion about these personalities. Of course, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam and the Sahaba, they have their own position. But when we talk about the different scholars and the Islamic personalities throughout the eras, the reason why we talk about them, my dear brothers and sisters, is not simply just for the sake of the story. It's not simply just for the sake of knowing that happened inside the past. MashaAllah, look at our history, and to have some izzah, to have some pride over the fact that one day Islam was great. That's not the reason why we study these personalities. Rather, the reason why we study these personalities is in order to understand the way they used to think, to understand the way they used to act. In order to what? In order to then follow their example in the good that they did. This is the reason why we are studying these personalities. In order to understand the way they used to think, the way they used to act, their relationships in the society, their relationships with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their relationships with themselves, not for the sake of saying that was the history and how great the history was and how we wish we could have Ibn Taymiyyah today as he was then, but rather for us to think about it, to reflect about it, to strengthen ourselves and to change our way of thinking, and to say, look, this is how the great Islamic personalities used to think in the past. And in order to understand the way they used to think, and in order to understand the ijtihad that they used to do, we need to understand their reality and what was going on around them. Why was Ahmed bin Hanbal, for example, discussing the issue of Khalq al-Qur'an? The issue of is the Qur'an the created word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. Why was Ahmad bin Hanbal talking about that? The Sahaba radiallahu anhum never used to talk about that. So why did Ahmad bin Hanbal have to talk about that? And Ahmad bin Hanbal didn't used to talk about the idea of wahda, which is a Sufi idea of wahda. And yet Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah talked very much addressing the issue of al-wahda. Why is that? So we need to look and understand the reality and see what was going on around them in order to understand the way they used to think. And a disclaimer beforehand, or a note of advice for us all beforehand, is, as was mentioned, every man, you take from him, you take from his words, and you leave his words. Every man, you take from some of his words, and you leave from some of his words. Except for Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. Because Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, we know, he said inside the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. That he doesn't say anything from his own desires. Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam doesn't say anything from his own desires. It's only wahi, it's only revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, we take from him everything. Because he is the perfect example. When Aisha radiallahu anha was asked, what was the personality of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam? Then she replied back, don't you read the Qur'an? And the person replied, yes, I read the Qur'an. I said, the character of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was the Qur'an. So Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, we take everything from him. Other than Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, you take what is good and you leave whatever mistakes they made. As Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam mentioned, إِذَا حَكَمَ حَاكِمٌ فَاجْتَهَدَ فَأَصَابَ فَلَهُ أَجْرَانِ. If a ruler makes a ruling, if a judge makes a ruling, and he does his ijtihad, and he's correct, then he gets 2 rewards. And if he's wrong, then he gets 1 reward. So we don't blame them for any mistakes they may have made in their sincerity, because we know all of these ulama were seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we don't blame them in any mistakes that they made, but rather we need to see what was the good things they said and what was the wrong things they said. And I say this, brothers, because we can easily get into the trap where we think, well, if Shaykh Kada didn't say it, then it can't be right. Whether that's Shaykh Imam Shafi'i, or Shaykh Imam Abu Hanifa, or Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, someone can say, well, Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah disagreed with this opinion. Sahih, maybe he disagrees with some opinions that other scholars held. But what makes Ibn Taymiyyah correct and the other scholar wrong is not Ibn Taymiyyah himself, it's the Qur'an and the Sunnah of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. It comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. And Ibn Taymiyyah himself mentioned, whoever the asaba, whoever has any ta'assub is like madhabism, holding tight to a madhab, whoever has a partisanship, whoever has a partisanship for any of the ai''imah, for any of the imams, then he is following like the people who follow their desires. He is like the people who follow their desires. Whether they are following Imam Abu Hanifa, or whether they are saying they are following Imam Shafi'i, or whether they are saying they are following Imam Ahmad, which was the madhab which Ibn Taymiyyah himself was raised upon, was on the madhab of Imam Ahmad. So if Ibn Taymiyyah was saying this about the great ai''imah of this ummah, was saying this about the 4 ulama who represent the 4 madhahib, then definitely he intended that his words would also be implemented upon himself. Definitely he intended that no one should just hold on to his opinions in a partisan way. And Ibn Kathir, one of the students of Ibn Taymiyyah, admits to that. So when he writes the description of Ibn Taymiyyah and talks about him, he says he was a man, and like any man, he did things correctly, he said things which were correct, and he did things which were incorrect. Even though, Ibn Kathir says, even though the amount of things which were incorrect from him pales in its significance to the things which were correct from him. And so this is Ibn Kathir, one of his students who had a great love for him. Al-Imam al-Dhahabi mentioned about Ibn Taymiyyah that he had a wide knowledge, and he had a clear courage. But, this is Dhahabi mentions, he says, but people used to complain about him, his manners sometimes, and his actions. So this is Imam Dhahabi. He said about him, he said, Ibn Taymiyyah is like a sea which has no limits. He's like a treasure which had no comparison. And yet, there were some things, which you shouldn't take from Ibn Taymiyyah. There are some things which you shouldn't follow him. Like any man apart from Rasulullah alayhi salatu wassalam. And Imam Dhahabi himself said, he said, there are two types of people with regards to Ibn Taymiyyah. There are the people who love him and they have the severe love for him. So it takes them to the partisanship. And there are people who dislike him and hate him and they have a severe hate for him. And so that takes them to the other end of the partisanship. And he said, whatever I've written about Ibn Taymiyyah, I get complaints from both of the sides. So the ones who hate him say, how could you praise him for his knowledge? And the ones who love him say, how could you dispraise him in anything? You have been unjust towards him. And so we know from this that Ibn Taymiyyah himself was a polarizing figure in that sense. To polarize people between the two extremes of extreme love for him or extreme dislike for him. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not make us from those who are extreme in any of these kind of issues. That when we look at the life of Ibn Taymiyyah and when we try and learn from his experiences and follow his example, may Allah help us to take what is right from him, and may Allah keep away from us what Ibn Taymiyyah himself would have wanted to keep away from us. Because Ibn Taymiyyah himself would not have wanted anyone to follow him in any of his mistakes or in any of his shortcomings. But the description of Ibn Taymiyyah by one of his students who came and stayed with him for a little while, in terms of his characteristics, his humility, his wide knowledge, his constant reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibn Taymiyyah had such a wide knowledge, brothers, that he used to sit in the masjid after the prayer and the circle would gather around him and one of the people would just read something from the Qur'an. Be his choice. He would just read whatever he wanted from the Qur'an. And Ibn Taymiyyah would then do tafsir from that point onwards. Without any books, without any notes, without relying upon anything, he would just hear those ayahs, say khalas, and then from that point onwards, and he could give a lesson. They said even by the time the next prayer comes, the lesson is not, he could have gone on, we feel like he could go on all night talking about those ayat alone. This was the example of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was born in 661 Hijri to a family of scholars, ulama. His father was a scholar. His grandfather was a scholar. His uncle was a scholar. His father was a scholar. He was one of the leading ulama in the ilm of hadith. And they were all from the Hanbali madhab. At the age of 7, they had to leave their town and go to Damascus because of the invasion of the Mongols, the Tatar. And so many of the ulama from those regions, they all collected inside Damascus. And so Ibn Taymiyyah was living in an environment, a scholar's environment. His father had a seat in the masjid to teach hadith to other ulama. So this is someone who he would sit and study with and learn from. And so he would have access to all kinds of ulama. It's mentioned that he studied, he had more than 200 shuyukh. More than 200. 200 ulama that Ibn Taymiyyah studied with. But look at the sincerity of his studies. When his father in his young age was getting him to memorize Qur'an, he gave his Qur'an teacher 40 dirham. And he said to the Qur'an teacher, at the end of the month, when he's memorized, when my son has memorized a certain amount, give him the 40 dirham. Give him the 40 dirham to encourage him to say, well done, you memorized juz or whatever it was that he's memorized. Have something in order to encourage him further. So this is how his father thought. And so at the end of the month, the Qur'an teacher of Ibn Taymiyyah brings out the 40 dirham to give to him and says, take this for the memorization which you've done, mashallah, and he continued trying to encourage him. Ibn Taymiyyah refuses to push it on him. He said, I made a promise with Allah not to take any money from Qur'an. This is a child. A child saying, I made a promise with Allah that I wouldn't take any money for Qur'an. So you can see the special nature of this young boy, who said that when he was studying, he didn't need to use a book or a pen or a paper or any of these kind of things. He just used to hear and it would sink into him. And the news about his abilities traveled to other cities even. So some ulama came to visit. When they came to visit Damascus, they asked about him. Where is this young man that we've heard about? And so one person pointed him out. And he was carrying a board with him. And so this alim of hadith called him to him and said, okay, write down these 10 ahadith or so, maybe 10 or a few more than 10 ahadith on the board as I narrated to you. So he narrated to him these 10 or 12 hadith. So he looked at them, read them. He said, wipe them off. He wiped them off. He said, read them back to me. So he's written them down just then, looked at them, said, wipe them off. He wipes them off and says, read them back to me. And so then Ibn Taymiyyah read them back to him as it had been written down in the first place. And so the alim said, if this young boy lives, then he will have sha'nun azim. He will have a great matter. And he will be someone who has an impact. He says, the likes of this are not seen. In that time, that kind of ability, which given to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wasn't seen. And so, not only did he get to study hadith and the fiqh in the madhab of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal with his father, but he also, after that, became very specialized in studying Arabic language. And the environment in Damascus, brothers, Damascus was dominated by the Shafi'i madhab because of Salah ad-Din. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi was Shafi'i. And so because of him, he had put into place in the different positions of ruling and teaching and so on and so forth, majority of them Shafi'i scholars. And so the Shafi'i madhab had a position of sovereignty, if you like, dominated in the public in Damascus. And also the thoughts of the Ash'ari were also dominant there. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi was also Ash'ari. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, who comes from a different background, the Hanbali background, he used to be engaged in many debates and discussions. This is the environment that he was growing up in. But he had a different opinion from the other people. They were just following madahib. He had a more open mind. He wanted to go back to the Qur'an and the Sunnah. But even in those early years, the fact that he came from a Hanbali family and they were in an environment where the Shafi'i madhab was dominant, made him have this debates and discussions. Even one of the great scholars of his era, who was before Ibn Taymiyyah, but they came at the same time and saw him, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. And so Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, was asked of him, why don't you speak to Ibn Taymiyyah? At one time, he's older than him anyway. And he said something, he said, this man loves speaking, whereas I like silence. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, you can see that he was someone who was very straight, willing to stand up for what he believed to be the truth. And then, brothers, by the time that he was just over the age of 20 by a little bit, he began to take the position of teaching even inside Damascus. And that we mentioned about him, كَأَنَّ عَيْنَيْهِ لِسَانًا نَاطِقًا, as if his two eyes are like tongues which pronounce. As if his two eyes are like tongues which pronounce. And Ibn Daqiq al-Eid said, I saw a man who gathered all of the knowledge between his two eyes. I saw a man as though he gathered all the knowledge between his two eyes. So this is the environment of seeking knowledge and sincerity and discussion that Ibn Taymiyyah grew up in. But also the circumstances of his era were very difficult circumstances. Because the Muslim Ummah was being attacked on one side by the Tatar, it was being attacked on the other side by the Crusaders, and inside itself, people were fighting amongst themselves. There were internal battles. And when we talk about the Tatar, who were these Mongols, brothers? Who were they? What were their characteristics? Ibn Kathir describes them saying that when the sun would rise, they used to worship the sun. When the sun would rise, they would worship the sun. And they didn't used to make anything haram. Nothing was haram to them. They would eat anything, even dogs and pigs. Whatever they came across, they could eat it. And they didn't understand the issue of nikah. They didn't have any nikah between them. There was no organizing the relationship between the men and the women. Just like the Jahiliyyah before the coming of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. And some years before the birth of Ibn Taymiyyah, the sacking of Baghdad took place. And the Khalifa al-Musta'sam was killed. And then after this, we had the Battle of Ain Jalut, which also occurred just a few years before the birth of Ibn Taymiyyah, which was the big defeat for the Mongols. But after the Khalifa was killed in Baghdad, what happened? The Muslims began to look around to who can take the leadership of the Ummah. And so they found, in Egypt, they found his sons. And so they gave bay'ah to one of his sons, Abu al-Qasim, one of the sons of the previous Khalifa. And Abu al-Qasim, he took bay'ah from the notables and from the people of power and influence in Egypt. And amongst them was the great scholar, Izzuddin Abdul Salam. Izzuddin gave him bay'ah. And Abu al-Qasim straight away went for jihad to throw out the Tatar from Baghdad. And he had some victories on the way to Baghdad, but he wasn't able to make it before he was defeated and killed by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, shaheed Insha'Allah. And so then, they sought who would be the next ruler, and they took his brother Al-Hakim, and they gave him bay'ah. And Al-Hakim then went the next day to give khutbah in Jum'ah. And his khutbah, he said to the people, اعلموا أن الإمامة فرض من فروض الإسلام. Know that imamah, the khilafah, the leadership is an obligation from the obligations of Islam. والجهاد محكوم على جميع الأنام. And jihad is obligated upon all of the people. ولا يقوم على الجهاد إلا باجتماع كلمة العباد. And jihad will not be established except with the unity of the words of the slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the khutbah which Al-Hakim gave the day after he was given the bay'ah. A khutbah of unity, a khutbah of jihad. And this is clear, brothers. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions inside the Qur'an, وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. Those who disbelieve, they are protectors and helpers to one another. إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوهُ تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. And if you don't do that, if you do not unify yourselves, then there will be fitna on the earth and a lot of fasad. So this is what Al-Hakim did when he took the bay'ah. So this is all happening just around the birth of Ibn Taymiyyah. This is the environment which he's being brought up in. He's being brought up in the environment of Izzuddin Abdul Salam, the Shaykh who would give the fatwa to aid the jihad in order to throw the Tatar out of the Muslim lands. And he lived in the era in the same time as Imam Nawawi. Imam Nawawi is a famous scholar from the Shafi'i madhab. He's the mu'azzamid alayhi in the Shafi'i madhab. And Imam Nawawi was in Damascus when one of the sultans, Al-Zahir, Beybers, came along and demanded the people to pay taxes in order to fund the jihad. And this fatwa, brothers, it had originally been passed some years beforehand by Izzuddin Abdul Salam, because there was a need to raise more taxes other than the normal Islamic taxes, which are narrated inside the books of fiqh. And Izzuddin Abdul Salam saw the necessity in his day, and so he gave this fatwa. And so then, Al-Zahir wanted this fatwa to be redone again for his time, and all of the ulama of Damascus signed it, except for Imam Nawawi. Imam Nawawi sent a letter back to Al-Zahir, and he asked him, you are a leader who's ruling by Islam, and we know that you love Islam. And so he accounted him, saying, how can you tax the people this kind of oppressive taxes? And he gave certain advice inside his letter. It's a long letter. But Al-Zahir Babers, when he replied back, he replied back in a very violent manner to Imam Nawawi. And he even accused him, saying, how come you didn't used to account the Mongols, and now you're accounting me? How come you wouldn't account the Mongols, and yet you're accounting me? And so then Imam Nawawi takes another reply back and sends it back to him, saying, how could I count the Tatar when they're kuffar? How do you want me to account? On what basis? They do not believe in Qur'an and Sunnah. How am I going to account them? And you're the Muslim leader, I'm accounting you according to Qur'an and Sunnah. And so then Al-Zahir came down. He came to Damascus himself and called Imam Nawawi to his court. And they had the argument inside the court. And Imam Nawawi said to him, look at your people inside your court. You have 200 women, slave girls. And they're all wearing gold. They're all wearing gold, and your whole court is full of people wearing gold and living in a luxurious lifestyle. He said, until you sell all of this wealth and luxury around you and get rid of it, then I won't give you a fatwa. And so then they ordered him to be removed from Damascus. And so Imam Nawawi left Damascus. And then the ulama all complained, how can you remove him? How can you exile this imam? He is one of the great imams from amongst us. And so then they called him back. And Imam Nawawi said, no, I won't return. He refused to return. He said, I will not return until he leaves. I will not come back into Damascus until he leaves. 1 month after that, Babers died. And then Imam Nawawi returned back. And Ibn Taymiyyah was 15, 16 years old when all of this was going on. So he grew up in the environment, seeing the ulama accounting and interacting on the basis of Islam with the rulers. Such that when he was a young age, 30 years old, when they heard of one man who had insulted the Prophet, he went with another Shaykh to go and complain to the Na'ib al-Sultan, the representative or the deputy of the ruler of Damascus. It shows you how he used to take concern over the affairs. How can someone be insulting Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam if they went out to go and account them? Then brothers, when the Tatar actually came and Qazan actually came to attack Damascus and break some of the agreements they had with the Muslims there, you found all of the ulama and all of the rulers in Damascus leaving. Leaving because the Mongols, they had the reputation, even though they had been defeated in Ain Jalut, even though they were really in a decline, but still some people were afraid of them. Except for one man didn't leave, Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah remained, and he gathered around him a delegation to go and address Qazan directly. And he went to his camp and addressed him directly. And he said he addressed him in a powerful way, with Qur'an and Sunnah, saying him that you claim to be a Muslim. Because at this time the Tatars were claiming to be Muslims. Saying you claim to be a Muslim, and your father and grandfather, who didn't claim to be Muslims, they did not do what you're doing. In terms of treachery and so on and so forth. They counted him in this harsh manner. To his face, it said that, and the description of it is he came knee to knee with him. And Qazan said, I've never seen anyone like him before. He was so impressed by him, he said, I've never seen anyone like him before. And so he agreed not to enter into Damascus at that time. Then they broke the agreement, entered in, took some prisoners. So Ibn Taymiyyah went out again, in order to get the prisoners back from them, release the prisoners. And so they released all the Muslim prisoners. But they had amongst them some of the Christians and some of the non-Muslims who were living in Damascus. And he refused just to take the Muslim prisoners. He said, you have to give me the Ahlul Dhimma as well. These people had a contract with us, who were living underneath our authority, who we were guaranteeing their rights. We cannot abandon them to you. You have to give them to us. Free them along with the Muslims. And so, freed the Ahlul Dhimma along with the Muslims. This was the example of Ibn Taymiyyah. So when 1 year later, again the Tatar were coming, this time Ibn Taymiyyah gave the khutbah of jihad. By this point we know there's no debating, no discussing, no waft, no delegations. This time he gave khutbah of jihad, encouraging the people, preparing them for jihad. And then he went from Damascus, he went to Egypt, to Cairo. Why? Because Cairo was the seat of the Khilafah. He went to the seat of the Khilafah and he addressed in the court of the rulers there, he addressed them, saying to them, if you are not rulers, if you were not rulers and kings, and we sought your help, i.e. the people of Damascus, they sought your help, it would be obligatory upon you to help them. So what about it when you are actually their rulers and their kings? So look at Ibn Taymiyyah, he understood even, as he called it himself, as-siyasa shar'iyya. He understood that. When he wanted to defend Damascus, he went to where the seat of the Khilafah, to call the Sultan there, prepare an army and send it. And from his encouragement, an army was prepared. And when he returned back to Damascus, he found the people were in terror once again. And he returned back and he calmed the nerves. And the Tatar, after hearing about the preparations and everything else, then left and didn't do the attack that time. So look how Ibn Taymiyyah, he understood the hadith of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, when he said, "Kullukum ra'in." He said, each one of you is a shepherd, and each one of you is responsible for his flock. And the Imam is the shepherd, and he is responsible for his flock. Then, brothers, in the year 702, Ibn Taymiyyah actually fought the jihad with the Tatar. That they came during the month of Ramadan, and some fights were taking place. And Ibn Taymiyyah used to do iftar himself. And he used to encourage the soldiers with him also to make iftar, saying, don't fast in these days, because the fasting will make you weaker from the fighting. And we know that when you're fighting, Islamically the fiqh is you can break your fast. Otherwise, you may be weaker if the battle is going on. So Ibn Taymiyyah really won the hearts of the people. Really won the hearts of the people through his stance through these years. His stance of bravery, single-handedness in front of the Tatar. This is why the average people in Damascus, they used to love him. But the ulama, they were split. Because you have jealousy between people. Ulama are not anbiya. Ulama are not prophets. They are not perfect. So ulama, they can have jealousy, they can have differences. They can have, I'm the official alim. I'm the one who's inside the court. This Ibn Taymiyyah, he doesn't have any position. How come the people love him? For example, this is what could go through someone's mind if the shaitan puts it into his mind. Because Ibn Taymiyyah had no official position. And yet, he was loved by the people more than anyone else in Damascus. And so one of his students was reading a book. And this book was debating some issues inside Aqidah. And at this time, the Sultan of Damascus, who was a close associate of Ibn Taymiyyah, was actually out of Damascus. And so the Shafi'i Imam took his student and jailed him. Took the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was Ibn Mizzi, and jailed him. And when Ibn Taymiyyah heard about this, he became angry and went to the jail and freed him with his own hands. And then they had the argument when the Sultan returned. And the judge, the Shafi'i judge, said, I'm going to remove myself from my position unless you put him back into jail. So they put him back into jail a second time, but let him go. In order to keep the Shafi'i judge happy, and in order for justice to be. And what happened was, Al-Nasir, who was the Sultan, ordered that no one should discuss Aqidah at that time. Ordered that no one should discuss these issues inside Aqidah at that time because it's causing fitna between the people. The book which he was reading was Radd al-Aqidah. So they were discussing some issues around Sifat and so on and so forth. And so, because of confusion amongst the people, he just said no one should discuss Aqidah. Then brothers, wallahi, I can speak for much more time about the trials of Ibn Taymiyyah. He went to Egypt after that because he was called to Egypt by the ulama over there. And then he was accused inside the court of the alim there, which was Zayn al-Din, a Maliki scholar, who began to question him on many issues inside Aqidah again. And then he said to him, who's going to be the judge between us? He realized he's there for a judgment. It's not a discussion, it's not a debate. The guy is asking him, making an inquisition on him. He says, who is going to be the judge between us? Zainuddin said, I am. He said, how can you be the judge when you're the one who's debating with him? And so Zainuddin became angry and threw him into the jail. And we should know, brothers, this Imam Zainuddin, may Allah have mercy upon him as well, that he was a very harsh, strict judge. People who used to disagree with him in issues, in Aqidah, he used to have them executed. This was his position. And so Ibn Taymiyyah must have heard about this, he realized what was happening, so he refused to debate. And he ended up spending 1.5 years in jail until he was released from jail without any conditions whatsoever. And one of the reasons why they used to dislike him, some of the ulama, was because he spoke, not some of the ulama, but some of the Sufi elements, was because he spoke against the issue of wahda. Because of the wahda, we won't go into the details of it, brothers, but some people were saying that you could reach a state where you become one with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at that point, you don't have to follow the sharia. So you get so close to Allah, now you don't have to follow the sharia, because the whole point of the sharia is to make you close to Allah. Now you've reached it, you don't have to follow the sharia anymore. And so Ibn Taymiyyah was very harsh against this opinion. He was very harsh against this opinion because it's basically getting rid of the sharia. It's destroying the sharia. And because there were a lot of followers of Ibn Arabi inside Egypt at this time, people were very much against him. But again, he persevered. He was jailed another time, and then freed another time. But when he left Egypt, by the time he left Egypt, even Zainuddin was praising him, saying, we tried to get our power over him and we were unable to. And when he had the chance to have revenge upon us, he didn't take it. And I never saw anyone like him. This is how his opponents even saw him. And then after this, he returned back to Damascus. And then, brothers, there were other fitna involving Ibn Taymiyyah, other debates and discussions, because he wanted independence of thought. He didn't want to be bound by the madahib. He wanted people to go back to the Qur'an and Sunnah directly, which in itself is a good thing. But this caused some conflicts. And so he was jailed more than once. He was jailed once for a fatwa which he did on talaq, on divorce. And then towards the end of his life, he was jailed another time for his fatwa on visiting the graves of the Prophet. The grave of the Prophet ﷺ. And he ended up dying in jail. And even though he died in jail, brothers, when they came for his janazah, the whole of Damascus, apart from, they say, 3 people, came out to pray. And those 3 people were just people who had such empty for them that they were afraid to leave their houses in case people, grab them and beat them up and whatever was at that time. So, hundreds of thousands, the narration is hundreds of thousands of people came out to pray the janazah of Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Kathir gives a long description of the janazah and what happened, and you could see from that the love of the people for him. I would have liked to have discussed these issues in detail, brothers, but I'm going to move bi'idhnillahi ta'ala onto some discussion on the wrong concepts that people have regarding Ibn Taymiyyah. Some of the misunderstandings people have regarding Ibn Taymiyyah. And so the first misunderstanding is that because Ibn Taymiyyah was so powerful in his discussions about Aqidah, and he was very harsh when he used certain terms, say this is kufr, this is jahl, people now take this and they think that Ibn Taymiyyah gives them the right to make takfir upon people. Ibn Taymiyyah said this is kufr, so this person is a kafir. Anyone who believes this, he must be a kafir. Anyone who believes that, he must be a kafir. And yet Ibn Taymiyyah, brothers, if you read his works widely, you realize that when he says this is kufr and this is jahl, he's using those words to explain the ideas, but he wasn't using those words to explain the people who held those ideas. He didn't used to do takfir of the one who held the ideas, because he said that there might be things which haven't been explained to him yet. He may not have understood things correctly. And there's one debate which he had in front of the people of Ahlul Bid'ah of his time. And he even mentions the quote. They said to them, he said, أَنَا لَوْ وَفَقْتُكُمْ كُنْتُ كَافِرًا. If I agreed with you, I would be a kafir. If I agreed with you, I would be a kafir. لأني أعلم قولكم كفر. Because I know that what you're saying is kufr. وأنتم عندي لا تكفرون لأنكم جهال. But you, to me, do not disbelieve. You're not disbelievers because you are ignorant. And who was he talking to, brothers? He says, and I was talking to the ulama, to the shuyukh, to the judges, and to the leaders of the Jahmiyyah. Jahmiyyah is one of the fiercest people that he was against. Because the Jahmiyyah, some of the ideas of the Jahmiyyah was, they denied completely the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he was against them much more than he was against, for example, the Mu'tazila or against the Ash'ari. Jahmi, and still he said about them, he said, if I said what you said, I would be a kafir. But as for you, you're not kuffar to me, because you're ignorant. And he was speaking to who? The most knowledgeable amongst them. So, we should understand that about Ibn Taymiyyah and understand how he used to see these different opinions. And even when he was asked about the prayer behind the people of Ahlul Bid'ah, if there's a place where there's only one imam, one masjid, one imam to pray behind, and this imam was Jahmi, or he was a Rafida, he was a Shi'i, could we pray behind him? And he said, anyone who doesn't pray behind him and rather makes him a kafir, let him know that he's actually following the madhab of the Shi'i, because that's what the Shi'i do. They make takfir of all the Ahlul Sunnah and so on and so forth. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah said. So you can pray behind the Muqtadi. It's better not to if there's an alternative. But if there's no alternative, you pray behind him the Jum'ah. You pray behind him the Jama'ah. Because that comes before anything else. Which means he obviously saw them as Muslims, because the Salah is not valid behind Ahlul Bid'ah. And something very important, brothers. Ibn Taymiyyah said inside, when giving this fatwa, he said something, it's not for you to know what the Aqidah of your Imam is. It's not for you, you don't need to know the Aqidah of your Imam. He said it very explicitly. He said, you don't need to know the Aqidah of your Imam, and it's not for you to examine him. It's not for you to go and ask him, what do you believe? Rather, you pray behind him, and he's unknown to you. This is the words of Ibn Taymiyyah. This is the first misconception. The second misconception, that he was against following the madhahib. And actually inside his words, he says that the general people, they have to follow a sincere scholar. The general people cannot look at the Qur'an and Sunnah because they won't get anywhere. They cannot pick up Sahih Bukhari and understand what's going on, because there are many evidences. And then there's the Qur'an as well. And then there's the way you have to look at the evidences. So the average people, they have to follow the righteous scholars amongst the people. This is the words of Ibn Taymiyyah. So no one should be saying, brothers, you shouldn't follow a scholar. You shouldn't follow this. Rather, if someone doesn't have the knowledge to be able to judge between these different words, and he's saying this, then let him know that he's actually following his desires. Because how is he able to judge between the different evidences and the different peoples if he doesn't have the basics such as a deep knowledge or a good reasonable knowledge of the Arabic language at least? We can't have people doing tarjih between aqwal, we can't have people doing preferences between different opinions based upon English translation of Sahih Bukhari. It doesn't work this way. This is not Islam. And Ibn Taymiyyah was known to understand there can be ikhtilaf. And in fact, he wrote a whole risala on the issue of ikhtilaf and why there might be ikhtilaf. The hadith might not be known to someone. It might be known to someone, but they consider it da'if. It might be known to someone, but they consider a qiyas to be stronger than that hadith. So he gives all these different reasons, excuses, for why you should make excuses for all the ulama. And yet today, brothers, someone gave me a story recently. He says inside his university, people pull down the timetable which has written on it the times for the Hanafi madhab. Saying this is Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy al Munkar, is to pull down this timetable. Another misconception, brothers, is that Ibn Taymiyyah was somehow a jihadi who would gather around him just a group of people to go and fight jihad. And people talk about it in this way today. No, this is not, as I've given in the discussion, brothers, and I've presented to you. Ibn Taymiyyah worked with the rulers and called upon the armies at his time, and because they were the ones who had the power. This is how Ibn Taymiyyah worked. So it wasn't that he just gathered around a band of other noble scholars like himself who had good training and went off and fought. This is not the manhaj of Ibn Taymiyyah. Rather, he went to the court of the Khalifa in Egypt in order to call them and tell them, you are responsible for us. So you need to send the army to defend us against the Tatar. And the other concept some people have with Ibn Taymiyyah, brothers, and they use him for this way, inshallah, the last one, is the idea of we have to work for Tawheed before we work for Khilafah. We have to work for Tawheed qabla al-Khilafah. And this is right from one angle and wrong from another angle. It's right from the angle of that you have to work for Khilafah amongst Muslims who say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. This is true. You can't call for Khilafah This is the most natural way to fall for the khilaf. You have to have people who become Muslims or are Muslims to establish the khilaf. So it's right from that angle. It's wrong from the angle that they want to say, no, but everyone has to agree with the way that such and such a Shaykh has divided the Aqidah into these 3 different parts. And if he doesn't agree with the way that I understand Sifat, or the way that Ibn Taymiyyah understood Sifat, then we can't do unity with them. This has never happened in the past, after the time of the Sahaba, and will never happen again in the future. Wallahu a'lam. Wallahu a'lam. But the point is, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, in his time the Khalifa was Mu'tazili. He's from the Mu'tazila. And Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, when he was being tortured by that Khalifa, when he was being tortured by that Khalifa himself, he even said to him, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. He said to him, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, you want me to change my words to say that the Qur'an is created, but you need to bring me proof from Qur'an and Sunnah. That's how he was strong when he's being tortured by the Khalifa who was Mu'tazili. And Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, he wasn't Khalifa, but he was a leader over the army and a great Muslim leader who opened up Quds and many of the lands from the Crusaders. He was not on the same ideas exactly as Ibn Taymiyyah, for example. So the essence of the Aqidah, yes, in the belief in Allah, the belief in the Messenger, the belief in the books and all of the messengers and the Day of Judgment, yes. But in the details, no. And this is shown from Ibn Taymiyyah himself. Because the rulers and the people of his time were not upon his ideas. He was locked into jail because of his ideas and discussing his ideas. Irrespective of whether he was on the right or the wrong, that's not the discussion here. The point is that he did not consider his rulers not to be legitimate Islamic rulers. Rather, he considered them to be the legitimate Islamic rulers. So finally, brothers, the last thing I would say, and I have to be short in the words because I've already taken some time swimming with Ibn Taymiyyah with you. Wallahi, there's so much more that I've left out, and there's so much more that I don't know. It's a very beautiful the discussion around such a personality. But the last point I want to bring, brothers, is we need to look and analyze and say, how was Ibn Taymiyyah and why was he doing the things he was doing in his day? Why was Ahmad bin Hanbal doing the things he was doing in his day? May Allah have mercy upon them both. And we know that Ahmad bin Hanbal was standing up for the Aqidah of Islam, the correct Aqidah. He was standing up for that the Qur'an is the eternal word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was the last scholar standing to hold on to that. And if he hadn't held on to that, who knows how the belief would have been changed. But Allah says He will always keep a ta'ifa from the ummah upon the haqq. And so Ahmad bin Hanbal held on to this. Ibn Taymiyyah debated about the issues of wahda. But at the same time, when it came to defending the Muslim lands from the Tatar, he did what was necessary in those times. So what is the necessity of these days, brothers? These days we don't need to debate about Khalq Qur'an. That's a philosophical debate which happened centuries ago, which was won, walillahi alhamd, by Ahmad bin Hanbal. We don't need to discuss about wahda and these kind of issues. And people do not follow this apart from the very extremes. Rather, what's the fitna of this ummah in terms of ideas? It's the fitna of secularism, brothers. It's the fitna of ruling by other than Islam. That is what needs to be discussed. That is what needs to be changed. And the people need to be convinced to return back to Islam in order to establish the Khilafah, which Ibn Taymiyyah described himself. Ibn Taymiyyah described himself that if the ruler is righteous, then the people will be righteous. And if the ruler is evil and does the wrong things, then the people will be evil and do the wrong things to the extent that the ruler does. And so Ibn Taymiyyah saw that the community, the upholding of Islam in the community relied very much upon the rulers to be there. Which is why I opened my dua, brothers. The dua which I mentioned at the beginning. I took it from Siyas al-Shara'iyah, the opening of Siyas al-Shara'iyah, where he talks about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Muhammad as the seal of the messengers and sent him with the deen of truth and the guidance in order to be apart from all the other deeds, and along with it with qudra, with power and with the sword, in order to give help and in order to implement the punishments and to set forth the limits. This is the understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah bi'idhnillahi ta'ala with respect to those issues, brothers. And I do not believe, wallahu a'lam, I do not believe, as we can see from the example in his life, that he would be someone engaged in peripheral issues. When Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, he mentioned inside a hadith لَزَوَالِ الدُّنْيَا أَهْوَ. The whole dunya to go away, to be removed, is less to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the killing of a single mu'min without right. So for the whole of the dunya to be removed is less important to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the single mu'min to be killed without right. And how many believers have been killed on this day? Not yesterday. On this day, brothers. Go home, turn on the BBC, turn on Al Jazeera, and go and search and see where in the world. And believe me, the numbers which you know are dwarfed by the numbers that you don't know. You don't know about the brothers who are dying inside the prisons in Uzbekistan or Syria or wherever it may be. You don't know about those brothers and sisters. You only know what is on the news. So whatever is on the news in terms of 10 people killed here and 12 people killed there, and only one of them. For one to be killed, brothers, is worse than the whole of the dunya just to be thrown aside. فسبحان الله وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المؤمنين. And I just fulfill my apologies if I have taken the time with the discussion. As you can see, Wallahi, I've enjoyed swimming with the history of Ibn Taymiyyah with you.